Movi took place after 3 years of the biggest earthquake happened. This earthquake resulted in an endless dry season and global hunger, where the current condition of the Earth seems to be in the phase towards the end of time, with all human civilization that has begun to collapse, where the story will begin by showing a young man named Jiwan, who is hunting a crocodile. Using his bow and arrow, which he thought was successful, it turned out that the crocodile was still alive and actually attacked him back. And then... our favorite big man, named Don Lee, who is Jiwan's close friend, finally arrived. Only bringing a machete, he managed to execute the crocodile until the crocodile died on the spot.
아이, 맛있겠다. 봐.
아니, 내가 그거 다 잡은 건데 그거.
Scene moved to a girl named Suna, who lives with her grandmother. Since the earthquake disaster that occurred 3 years ago, this place has difficult access for clean water, so Suna and her grandmother have to save water, including filtering dirty water for their living needs.
주변에 온통 썩은 물뿐이네. 순아야, 그렇게 생각해.
Back to Don Lee, who turns out to be a butcher in his village. He is selling crocodile meat that he just caught. Money and jewelry have no value anymore. So, transactions have now returned to the barter system.
아이, 안 돼. 뭐야?
쌀이요, 쌀.
아저씨 갈게요.
조심히 가.
Not long after, a car appeared, which was a fake police officer who had often taken several people by force to be taken with them, where one of the residents whose tall and fit posture also tried to fight back. But... that's where they saw Suna, who looked young, healthy, and beautiful. Without much thought, one of the fake policemen grabbed Suna to come with them. Seeing the girl he liked in trouble, Jiwan, who had been holding back his patience, finally intervened. But because there were more of them, he was the one who had to be beaten up by the fake policeman. And Don Lee finally intervened. Not wanting to make a fuss, Don Lee was forced to take out his fist to make all the fake cops helpless. One of the fake cops admitted that they were only carrying out their duties according to orders from a criminal named Tiger. It turned out that Don Lee had known him in the past. Then he let them all go while leaving regard for the person named Tiger. When Don Lee and Jiwan were leaving for a hunt, they both accidentally saw Suna and her grandmother being visited by a group of people who claimed to be volunteers. The woman who also works as a teacher explained that they had a safe place in Seoul, specifically for teenagers, with a mission to protect future generations. The teacher and his team seemed very convincing, and Suna and Grandma decided to go with them.
아저씨도 나 꼭 보러 와야 돼요.
그래, 꼭 보러 갈게.
On the way to Seoul, Suna and Grandmother were not alone. But there are also other people, one of whom is called Susan, who happens to be the same age as Suna. Because the distance they traveled was very far, the elders would be taken to the clinic for treatment, which meant that Suna had to part with her grandmother for a while. Instead of being taken to the clinic, Suna's grandmother and an old man were taken to the edge of a cliff and finished off there. At the same time, Don Lee and Jiwan, who were hunting, also witnessed the incident. And then... Don Lee and Jiwan managed to knock out the two soldiers with a fatal attack and should be impossible to survive. But it turns out that both of them got up again, so it can be concluded that they are not ordinary humans. And a strange woman appeared who helped Don Lee and Jiwan, so that they managed to eliminate the two evil volunteers by chopping their heads off. After burying Suna's grandmother, Don Lee and Jiwan approached the foreign woman whose name Yuli. She claims to be a former soldier in the Special Forces and that the two volunteers they just faced were her former subordinates. Yuli also explained that the teacher and his group of volunteers were bad people. Likewise, the place they went to wasn't a good place like what the teacher said, but it turns out the apartment building is full of people with evil objective. Yuli also recounted the chronology that began 1 year ago. At that time, he and his colleague Kwan were searching for people who still survived the earthquake until they accidentally found an apartment building that was still standing strong and decided to make it a shelter for people who still survived. Until one day, a doctor named Yang Gisu appeared, the only doctor who might still be alive on planet Earth. Instead of helping people in need, Dr. Gisu turned out to be conducting some kind of experiment involving teenagers and underage children. He seems to be conducting research to create the latest generation of humans who are able to survive extreme conditions, such being able to live without food and water for months, having resistance to extreme conditions and fatal wounds, which then concluded that Dr. Gisu is creating human zombies. Knowing this experiment must involve teenagers and minors, Yuli, of course, rejects the idea, so there is a little debate which ends with a fight from his own colleague, Kwan, who turns out to be more in favor of Dr. Gisu than his own friend.
아무래도 양기수가 사람들한테 이상한 실험을 하는 것 같습니다.
Turning to Suna and friends who have arrived at the apartment, they are immediately greeted by Dr. Gisu, who gives a little speech before Suna and friends are finally taken to their rooms.
네, 여러분들 그동안 저 밖에서
Back to Don Lee and Jawan, who finally agree to help Yuli save the children from the apartment, especially since Suna is very close to them. The problem is that getting in there is certainly not easy, requiring a smart plan because there will be a lot of soldiers on guard. So Don Lee thinks of someone who might be able to help him, namely his past nemesis named Tiger, who is none other than the head of the fake police who appeared at the beginning. And here's Tiger, an end-of-the-world thug leader who's having a duel with another group of thugs. And when both groups don't accept the outcome of the fight, a brutal brawl ensues. Soon, Don Lee appeared and asked them all to stop. This is where we will finally find out if Don Lee was once a professional boxer who had managed to defeat many opponents, one of which was this Tiger. Tiger, who wanted revenge, asked the opposing group to help him, and this happened. Tiger was crying in pain with just one slap from Don Lee. While the group of opponents chose to flee from the scene, Don Lee also interrogated one by one Tiger's men, including Tiger himself, about where the location of this apartment and how to get in there. Since they all choose to remain silent, Don Lee gave a little shock therapy that was quite brutal and certainly painful to them.
그럼 좀 자고 있어. 들어오자. 몰라.
Not wanting to suffer the same as his men, Tiger chose to be honest by explaining that Dr. Gisu and his troops had managed to control all the clean water, so Tiger would have to work for Dr. Gisu by looking for teenagers and children to exchange for clean water. Once Don Lee had the information he wanted, Tiger was told to sleep even though he wasn't sleepy.
말하느라고 피곤할 텐데 한숨 자라.
아니, 나 뭐 그렇게 안 피곤한데?
아니 한숨 자.
Moving on to the apartment, Dr. Gisu began to instruct the new guests that people over the age of 30 would stay downstairs to work as clean water filters, along with the other workers, while teenagers would be taken upstairs to attend classes in order to continue educating the future generation.
우리가 마시는 맑은 물로.
Suna, who had arrived in the classroom, began to notice something strange when she saw the faces of the students who looked silent and obedient, without any expression, and there were same scars behind their ears of almost all the students in the class.
계속해서 물과 식량을 낭비되어 왔던 거예요. 그래야만 생존할 수 있는 이
It wasn't long before all the students were handed bottles of drinking water. While the other students immediately drank the water, Suna then asked about her grandmother's whereabouts, and the teacher replied that Suna's grandmother was seriously injured and would have to be treated in 2 to 3 days, which made Suna even more suspicious and decided not to drink the water.
미래입니다.
At night, Suna, who had a bad feeling about this place, decided to run away, which at the same time Susan's parents also urged the soldiers to show where her daughter was. Dr. Gisu was forced to intervene directly by taking them both into the lab where the experiment was.
아니 내가 분명히
Before Dr. Gisu and Susan's parents arrived at the lab, Suna apparently arrived there first and found some research books whose contents were truly shocking. Because Dr. Gisu had sacrificed hundreds of teenagers and children for this experiment, he combined human DNA and reptile DNA to create a new generation of humans that were hard to die and able to survive in extreme conditions. So now it all made sense why he had to brought himself and teenagers to this place. Suna quickly hid when Dr. Gisu and Susan's parents arrived at the lab. Without much ado, Dr. Gisu then immediately being honest that he was conducting experiments involving teenagers and children. Even his own daughter has become the first experimental subject in order to fulfill his wild ambitions. Seeing Susan lying on the operating table, his father quickly woke her up, which only made the situation worse. Susan's body suddenly had a severe seizure until she died instantly. Seeing his experimental subject has died, Dr. Gisu was furious and finished Susan's parents brutally. Unfortunate, Suna, who was hiding there, was found by Dr. Gisu and made Suna the new subject of his experiment.
마침 잘 됐네. 젊다는 거 참 좋아.
The next morning, Don Lee and his friends arrived at the apartment gate with Tiger as their guide. With the excuse of delivering fresh teenagers, Tiger tried to negotiate with a guard to be allowed to enter, but instead of went with their smart plan without getting caught, Don Lee, who knows that they didn't have much time, went straight in and attacked the guards. Even Tiger, the chief thug, looked terrified and couldn't get over Don Lee's brutality.
저 사람들.
Seeing Don Lee's attack begin, the teacher immediately reported it to Dr. Gisu. But since he was busy operating Suna, he continued his work and told the teacher to tell Kwan to take care of the problem. Don Lee finally headed to the basement in order to rescue Yuli's men who were locked up by Kwan. But what a surprise! Yuli's men all had become like zombies. So Don Lee was forced to face all of them. Finished with the zombies, Don Lee must now face Kwan and his troops who are heading to the basement, but suddenly Jiwan and Yuli are told to go up first to save Suna, while Don Lee himself will face Kwan's men who keep coming, where he had a little problem when he was about to take his sword, due to his overly large posture.
어딨어? 아이씨. 야, 지원아!
Just when Don Lee had finished cleaning up dozens of Kwan's men, Jiwan and Yuli were having trouble dealing with countless number of soldiers. To save time, Jiwan was ordered to go first, while Yuli will face them all alone. Kwon appeared, who was his own former colleague, where the two of them finally had met again and a duel began, with Yuli, who had managed to injure Kwon's face. However, Yuli also had to lose to Kwon, who threw him under the building. Next scene shown Jiwon was holding the teacher as hostage to find Suna, and Don Lee, who has arrived there, seems to be an worthy opponent for Kwon.
뭐 묻은 거야?
재밌네.
Here's where the adrenaline rush begins, as Don Lee struggles to defeat the half-zombie Kwon. Kwon is repeatedly punched and slammed, but he keeps getting back up, so Don Lee felt he had to execute him in a special way. Don Lee then threw him over the edge of the building and cut off Kwon's head to separate it from his lower body.
에이씨.
Realizing a lot of his troops were executed, Dr. Gisu quickly injected the serum produced from Suna's body sample. She didn't realize that Suna never drank the water provided by him, and the main requirement for the serum to work perfectly is that the experimental subject must drink water that has been mixed with a special chemical in order to stabilize the serum. So instead of strengthening his body, Dr. Gisu actually experienced serious problems. Soon, Jawan appeared with the teacher, who then immediately paralyzed by one of Dr. Jisu's female soldiers. Realizing this place doesn't last long, Dr. Gisu also plans to leave by carrying his daughter's body in a suitcase. But when going out, came Don Lee, who immediately finished off the female soldiers, including the teacher. So then Dr. Gisu, being sneaky, and threw a grenade to save himself and betray his own people. When arrived at the bottom floor, Dr. Gisu was immediately surrounded by parents who asked for their children whereabouts. With the condition of some of his body swollen due to serum failure, Gisu then began crazy by taking a gun and shooting at everyone until he accidentally hit the suitcase containing his own daughter's body. Instead of resurrecting his daughter, Dr. Gisu had to experience the pain of losing his beloved daughter again. Because of his own actions, his body then swelling badly, and Don Lee appeared without hesitation, finished him off on the spot. After it was all over, it suddenly rained for the first time in 3 years. Some children and teenagers can now return to their parents. The movie ends showing Don Lee's farewell to Yuli, where Don Lee and his friends will return to the village, and Yuli will manage the apartment here, so that they can start civilization peacefully. The end. What do you think about this movie? Let us know on comment down below. If you enjoy this video, please like and make sure to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out our next movie. That's all for today. See you on the next one.